The dust hangs low over the plain of Arsuf, thick with the copper scent of blood and the shimmering heat of the Levant. It is the afternoon of September 7th, 1191. Where moments ago the air was torn apart by the screaming of men, the clash of steel, and the thunder of hooves, there is now only a heavy, suffocating silence. In the span of just 17 minutes, the geopolitical landscape of the Holy Land has been violently rewritten. 17 minutes was all it took to shatter the aura of invincibility surrounding the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. Lying in the sand are 7,000 of Saladin's finest warriors, broken not by a siege or a starving winter, but by a single catastrophic collision. The casualty ratio is a staggering 10-1. It is a testament to the terrifying efficiency of the medieval era's ultimate weapon, the Frankish heavy cavalry charge. When the Iron Knights finally broke formation and unleashed their kinetic fury, they did not just defeat the enemy line, they evaporated it. But looking at the bodies tells only half the story. The victors standing over the dead are not fresh reinforcements. They are a ragged column of 12,000 men, parched by the sun, outnumbered nearly 3-1, and pushed to the very brink of psychological collapse. Their enemy was fresh, mobile, and led by the greatest tactical mind of the Islamic Golden Age. By all conventional logic of warfare, the Crusaders should have been slaughtered before noon. To understand this massacre, we must look beyond the armor and the swords. We must understand the inhuman discipline required to march into a furnace while being picked apart by arrows, and the cold strategic genius required to hold a charge until the precise second where patience transforms into annihilation. This is the anatomy of a miracle born from desperation. History remembers Richard Plantagenet as the Lionheart, a moniker earned through reckless bravery and a hunger for the fray. We think of him as the archetypal warrior king who led from the front, axe in hand, screaming for blood. Yet, as the Crusader army began its death march south from Acre, Richard displayed a temperament that baffled his enemies and infuriated his own knights. He stopped being a lion and became a stone. For 7 agonizing days, he forced 20,000 men to walk into a hurricane of Saracen arrows without breaking stride, and more importantly, without fighting back. This creates the central paradox of the Third Crusade. Why would the most aggressive king in Christendom command his army to endure a week of passive slaughter? The answer lies in a cold, counterintuitive calculus. Richard understood that Saladin's light cavalry thrived on chaos. They baited the Crusaders to charge, desperate to lure the heavy European knights out of their impenetrable formation and scatter them into the desert where they could be isolated and butchered. To defeat the master of mobility, Richard had to master the one thing a knight despises most: radical patience. He turned his army into a moving fortress, a creature of iron and discipline that refused to react to pain. But there is a darker truth to the Battle of Arsuf that is often scrubbed from the chronicles. The decisive charge that eventually shattered Saladin's army is frequently depicted as a stroke of tactical genius, a perfectly timed order given by a brilliant commander at the exact moment of maximum impact. The reality was far more terrifying. The famous charge was not a maneuver. It was a mutiny. It was the sound of human discipline snapping under the weight of 1,000 arrows. Richard did not initially order the assault that broke the Sultan's back. He merely managed to steer the avalanche once it had already begun to slide. But to understand the sheer, crushing weight of that moment, we must look backward, into the ashes from which this desperate army crawled. The charge at Arsuf was not born of confidence. It was born of a terror that had been festering for 4 long years. In 1187, at the Horns of Hattin, the Kingdom of Jerusalem did not merely lose a battle. It committed suicide. Through a catastrophic failure of command and the blinding arrogance of King Guy de Lusignan, the entire military aristocracy of the Latin East marched into a waterless wasteland to be encircled, tormented by heat and thirst, and finally butchered. In a single afternoon, the defensive spine of the Holy Land was snapped. The Templars and Hospitallers, the elite shock troops of Christendom, were not ransomed. They were executed by the hundreds, their heads piled like stones in the dust. What followed was a collapse of terrifying speed. Saladin, having decapitated the leadership of the Crusader states, swept through the Levant like a desert wind. He did not just conquer territory. He systematically dismantled the infrastructure of Christian power. Castles that had stood for 80 years opened their gates in surrender. Garrisons were empty. There was no one left to hold the walls. Then came the psychological killing blow, the fall of Jerusalem. The city was not just a strategic asset. It was the spiritual anchor of the entire enterprise. When Saladin entered the holy city, the true cross, the most sacred relic in Christendom, carried into battle as a divine standard, was captured and dragged upside down through the streets of Damascus. The symbolism was absolute. God, it seemed, had abandoned the Franks. By the time the Third Crusade was mobilized, the kingdom of Jerusalem was a fiction. It was a kingdom of memory, reduced to the city of Tyre and a few terrified coastal enclaves clinging to the Mediterranean shoreline by their fingernails. Saladin ruled everything from the mountains of Armenia to the borders of Egypt. He had unified the fractured Islamic world into a single, suffocating iron ring around the last survivors. We must therefore correct the lens through which we view this campaign. The Third Crusade was not an invasion, nor was it a war of conquest. It was a frantic, last-ditch rescue mission. It was an emergency transfusion for a patient that had already bled out. The men marching with Richard knew that they were walking into a graveyard of their own making. They understood that Saladin was not merely a general to be outmaneuvered, but a monolithic force who had already won the war before their ships had even left the docks of Europe. There was no margin for error, no strategic depth, and nowhere to retreat. A single defeat here would not just mean a lost campaign. It would mean the total extinction of Christianity in the Holy Land. The invaders had to force a foothold on a hostile coast where every acre of sand was already owned by the enemy, and the key to unlocking that foothold lay behind the formidable, sea-battered walls of Acre. To breach the stalemate at Acre, the Crusader coalition required more than religious fervor or numerical superiority. They required a mind capable of dismantling the impossible. History often remembers Richard the Lionheart as a romantic figure, a brash warrior king charging headlong into the fray with sword in hand. This caricature does a disservice to the terrifying reality of the man. Richard Plantagenet was a logistical savant and a cold, calculating professional who treated war not as an adventure, but as an industrial process. He understood what his contemporaries did not, that battles are won in the granaries and the armories long before the first arrow is loosed. While other European monarchs saw glory in the charge, Richard saw the mathematics of survival. He arrived in the Holy Land having effectively bankrupted the Angevin Empire to ensure his men were fed, paid, and armed with the finest steel. He was a master of the counterpunch, a disciplinarian who could force proud knights to hold their ground while arrows rained down upon them, waiting for the precise mathematical moment when the enemy overextended. He brought to the Levant a level of tactical discipline the West had not seen since the height of Rome. But standing against the Iron King was the unifier. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West simply as Saladin, operated on a plane of grand strategy that transcended the battlefield. If Richard was the hammer, Saladin was the water. Fluid, elusive, and relentless. He had achieved the miraculous task of stitching together the fractious mosaic of the Islamic Near East, uniting Kurds, Turks, Arabs, and Egyptians under a single banner of jihad. Saladin's genius lay in his patience. He understood that the Crusaders were heavy, hot, and far from home. He did not seek to match the brute force of the Frankish heavy cavalry. He sought to exhaust it. His method was psychological attrition, using mobility, heat, and thirst to unravel the enemy's mind before attacking his body. He was a diplomat general who held his fragile coalition together through sheer force of personality, fighting a war on two fronts, one against the invaders and one against the ambitious emirs within his own ranks. As the siege lines hardened around Acre, these two titans began a cerebral duel that would define the era. They had never met, yet they studied one another with the intimacy of old rivals. Richard analyzed Saladin's tendency to feint and retreat, preparing a discipline that would neutralize the Saracen mobility. Saladin studied Richard's supply lines and marching orders, looking for the single crack in the armor where he could insert the dagger. This was no longer just a war for territory. It was a chess match played with human lives. where a single moment of impatience from either commander would result in the slaughter of thousands. The board was set, the pieces were moving, and the collision was inevitable. Richard did not simply march an army south from Acre. He marched a fortress. He understood that in the searing heat of the Levant, against an enemy faster and more mobile than his own, the standard rules of engagement were a suicide pact. If he stretched his line, Saladin would cut it. If he chased the bait, he would be surrounded. So, Richard engineered a formation that defied the chaotic nature of medieval warfare. He built a box of iron and flesh, a moving castle designed to absorb punishment without breaking stride. To his right lay the Mediterranean Sea, a vast, unassailable blue flank that protected the army and allowed the Genoese fleet to shadow their movements, carrying supplies and the wounded. This turned a logistical nightmare into a manageable operation. But to his left, facing the interior, lay the desert and Saladin's waiting hordes. Here Richard placed his heavy infantry in a dense, overlapping wall. Men in thick gambesons and mail stood shoulder to shoulder, tasked not with killing, but with surviving. Behind this human rampart stood the crossbowmen, rotating in shifts to maintain a constant, suppressive volley against the Turkish horse archers. And in the very center of this column, protected like the heart of a living organism, rode the heavy cavalry. The Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Knights of the Realm were kept on a tight leash, shielded from the harassing arrows that would madden their horses. This was the genius of the formation. By protecting his cavalry, Richard preserved his knockout punch for the exact moment it would be needed, denying Saladin the ability to whittle down the Crusaders' most dangerous asset through attrition. For Saladin, this presented a strategic paradox that bordered on infuriating. He was the master of desert warfare, a commander who thrived on fluidity, feints, and speed. He expected the Crusaders to be brash, arrogant, and easily lured into the open. Instead, he faced a monolithic block that refused to react. His archers rained arrows down upon the column, but the shafts simply bounced off the armored shell or stuck harmlessly into the heavy felt of the infantry's padding. The Crusaders took the hits, stepped over the fallen, and kept walking. They were refusing to play his game. Yet, the geography of the coastal road was closing in. The terrain was narrowing, funneling the Crusader column between the sea and the dense forest of Arsuf. It was a corridor of death, a natural choke point where the maneuvering room would vanish, and the heat would become suffocating. Saladin knew that even a moving fortress has to stop eventually, or at least stumble. He began to mass his forces ahead, clogging the narrow passes, turning the landscape itself into a weapon. He was no longer trying to harass them. He was preparing to crush the box. As the trees of Arsuf loomed on the horizon, the discipline of Richard's men was pushed to its absolute breaking point, for they were walking directly into the kill zone Saladin had chosen. To understand the slaughter that was about to unfold at the edge of the forest, one must look past the politics of kings and examine the cold, hard physics of the engagement. This was not merely a clash of religions. It was a collision of two distinct doctrines of warfare, each engineered to destroy the other, yet totally incompatible in their application. On one side stood the Frankish heavy cavalry, mounted on the European destrier. These were not the nimble ponies of the steppes, but massive, chest-heavy beasts bred for explosive acceleration. A mounted knight in full kit represented over 1,500 pounds of combined mass moving at 20 miles per hour. The kinetic energy generated by such a charge was not a tactical maneuver. It was a mathematical inevitability. If this mass struck a static line, the laws of physics dictated that the line would not just break, it would liquefy. Opposing them was the fluid mobility of Saladin's Mamluks and Turkish light cavalry. Their doctrine was built on speed, spacing, and the composite bow. They were designed to dance around a slow opponent, bleeding them dry with 1,000 cuts before closing in for the kill. But at this specific moment in history, the technological balance had shifted in a way Saladin had not anticipated. The Saracen strategy relied entirely on the lethality of their arrows to break enemy formation. However, the Crusaders marching toward Arsuf were encased in a defensive technology that rendered the Turkish composite bow nearly obsolete at range. The European knight wore a heavy hauberk of riveted chainmail over a thick, quilted gambeson. This combination acted as a composite armor of its own. The steel rings stopped the penetration, while the dense padding absorbed the blunt force trauma. Saladin's archers watched in growing frustration as their shafts, fired with enough torque to pierce leather or skin, simply shattered against the Frankish column. The knights and foot soldiers became walking pincushions, with arrows protruding from their shields and padded surcoats, yet they continued to march unharmed and silent. This visual of invulnerability began to sow a seed of panic in the Muslim ranks. Nothing is more terrifying to a warrior than an enemy who refuses to bleed. Responding to this harassment was the Genoese crossbowman. While the Turkish archer could loose 6 arrows in the time it took a crossbowman to span his weapon once, the exchange rate favored the Europeans. The crossbow did not rely on the muscle of the shooter, but on mechanical tension stored in a steel or composite lath. When the trigger was pulled, it delivered a heavy iron bolt with flat trajectory stopping power that ignored the lighter lamellar armor of Saladin's troops. The math of the battlefield was cruel. The Saracens had to expose themselves to fire to get within effective range, entering a calculated kill zone where the slow, rhythmic thrum of European crossbows punched holes through men and horses alike. Saladin's swarm was buzzing against a window of iron glass, unable to sting the beast inside, unaware that the beast was coiled, waiting for the precise moment when discipline would give way to rage. For 7 days, the coastline became a purgatory of dust and iron. This was no longer a battle of maneuvers, but a slow, suffocating test of the human spirit. The Crusader columns stretched out like a steel snake, the sea protecting their right flank, while the left lay open to the hills, the forests, and the relentless fury of Saladin's army. The heat alone was enough to kill. In the height of the Levantine summer, temperatures soared past 100 degrees, turning every suit of chainmail into a personal oven. Men did not just sweat, they boiled within their own protection. Water was scarce, the air was thick with the copper taste of blood and the chalk of dry dust, and yet the column had to keep moving. From the tree lines, Saladin unleashed a psychological torment designed to break the mind long before it broke the body. His mounted archers, fast and uncatchable, would gallop to within yards of the Crusader line, loose their shafts, and will away before a sword could be drawn. They screamed, they banged drums, and they clashed cymbals, creating a cacophony that denied the Christians a moment of peace or a single clear thought. The resulting image was grotesque. Chroniclers from the time described the infantry and knights marching with 10, sometimes 20 arrows sticking from their thick felt gambesons and chainmail. They looked less like soldiers and more like armored porcupines, bristling with wooden shafts, walking steadily through a storm of missiles. This was the true genius of the march, and its agony. It requires a specific kind of courage to charge into death. It requires an entirely different, almost inhuman strength to walk slowly while death rains upon you, and do absolutely nothing in return. Every instinct in a knight's body screamed to break formation, to spur his horse, to charge the tormentors and run them down. But to charge was to die. To open a gap in the shield wall was to invite the swarm inside. So they marched. They stepped over the bodies of the fallen without stopping to mourn. The Hospitallers in the rear guard took the brunt of the abuse, walking backward, shields raised, absorbing the hate of an entire empire with silent, grinding discipline. But silence is not peace. Beneath the discipline, a pressure was building, a boiler with the safety valve welded shut. The men were not just suffering. They were remembering every arrow, every insult, and every wound. They were storing this kinetic energy for a release that would shake the earth. The march was ending, but the breaking point was rapidly approaching. The sun rose over the plain of Arsif on September 7th, illuminating a landscape that was no longer a battlefield, but a suffocating kill box. Saladin, the master tactician of the East, recognized that his window of opportunity was closing. He knew that if the Crusaders reached the orchards of Arsif, the terrain would neutralize his cavalry advantage. He had to break them here in the open or not at all. The Sultan abandoned the strategy of harassment and committed his entire army, 40,000 men, to a single crushing avalanche of steel. The pressure on the Crusader column shifted from severe to catastrophic. While the vanguard marched on, the rearguard, manned by the elite Knights Hospitaller, faced the full fury of the Islamic world. They were walking backward into hell. The Turkish mounted archers were no longer firing from a distance. They were pressing in so close that they could strike the Christian knights with maces and iron flails. They grabbed at the bridles of the Hospitaller warhorses, mocking the knights, spitting on their armor, daring them to break formation. For the Hospitallers, this was a torture worse than death. These were men bred for the charge, trained to answer violence with overwhelming force. Yet, under Richard's strict orders, they were forced to be passive victims. They watched their horses die beneath them and their brothers fall to arrows, forbidden to strike back. The discipline required to endure such abuse is almost alien to the modern mind, but even iron has a melting point. Garnier de Nablus, the master of the Hospitallers, felt that point arrive. He rode up the line to King Richard, pleading for permission to unleash a charge. He told the king that they were being shamed, that the horses were gone, that the men could take no more. Richard, cold and calculating, refused. The trap was not yet set. He needed the Saracens to fully commit, to exhaust their arrows, to come just a few steps closer. He ordered Garnier to hold the line. But the chaos of the rearguard had its own gravity. As the Saracens pressed in, striking the armor of the knights with a deafening clamor, the psychological dam burst. It was not fear that broke the line, but rage. Garnier de Nablus could no longer restrain the warrior instinct. With a cry of St. George, he defied his king. The master of the Hospitallers wheeled his horse around, and alongside the marshal of the order, he slammed into the enemy ranks. It was a moment of terrifying insubordination. In a split second, the meticulously planned marching formation dissolved. The charge rippled up the line like an electric shock. Richard, hearing the roar of battle behind him, faced a nightmare scenario. If he tried to stop the charge, his army would be cut in two and slaughtered in the confusion. If he did nothing, the Hospitallers would be isolated and annihilated. The Lionheart realized that the time for discipline had passed. He spurred his horse, signaling the trumpeters to sound the general attack. The waiting was over. The avalanche had begun. One solitary note from the clarion cut through the din of battle. It was the sound every man in the Christian line had been praying for, and every man in the Saracen army should have feared. For 7 agonizing hours, the Crusaders had been nothing more than targets, walking pincushions absorbing a relentless storm of arrows and heat. But with that trumpet blast, the passive endurance evaporated, replaced instantly by a singular, terrifying release of kinetic energy. The transformation was absolute. The infantry ranks parted like curtains, and from the gaps emerged the heavy cavalry of the military orders. The Hospitallers on the rear guard, pushed beyond the breaking point, struck first, followed instantly by the Templars and the Royal Knights. This was not a disorderly brawl. It was a mathematical equation of violence resolved in seconds. Thousands of armored warhorses accelerated in unison, their hooves churning the dry earth until the ground itself began to tremble with a frequency that could be felt in the chest before it could be heard. To the Muslim cavalry, who had spent the day tormenting a slow-moving column, the sight was paralyzing. Their tactical doctrine relied on speed, spacing, and the ability to retreat before a counterattack could form. But the Crusaders had not halted to form lines. They had launched from the march, catching the Saracens flat-footed and stationary. There was no time to turn, no space to accelerate, and nowhere to run. The impact was cataclysmic. The heavy European destriers, carrying armored knights weighing nearly a ton combined, slammed into the light Arab mares with the force of a falling mountain. The front line of Saladin's army did not break. It evaporated. Lances shattered shields and pierced through chainmail and flesh alike, driving the lighter enemy backward in a chaotic crush. The mobility that had been the Saracens' greatest asset became their death sentence. Packed too tightly to maneuver and pinned against the dense woodline of the Arsif forest, they were robbed of their speed and forced into a static grinding match against men who had trained their entire lives for exactly this kind of close-quarters butchery. Historians and chroniclers would later note that the outcome of the entire campaign was decided in this brief, violent window. It is known as the 17 minutes. In less time than it takes to cook a meal, the flower of Saladin's army was trampled into the dust. The psychological shock was total. The Saracens, who had come to believe the Iron Knights were weary and broken, found themselves facing a wall of wrath that seemed divinely inspired. As the dust clouds swirled over the broken bodies of the Sultan's vanguard, the Lionheart reined in his charger, looking out over a field that had been transformed from a desperate march into a slaughterhouse, knowing that while the battle was won, the war for the Holy Land had only just entered its bloodiest phase. The collision of Baldwin's heavy cavalry into Saladin's center was not a battle. It was an execution. The kinetic energy of thousands of armored warhorses, concentrated into a single, devastating wedge, shattered the Mamluk lines instantly. The sound of the impact was a deafening, sickening crunch of wood splintering against bone, a noise that signaled the end of tactical cohesion and the beginning of a massacre. Men who had trained for decades in the arts of skirmish and maneuver found themselves trampled into the dust before they could even draw their scimitars. The Frankish lance, a weapon of terrifying reach and weight, punched through chainmail and padded cloth with sickening ease, leaving the elite vanguard of the Ayyubid army broken on the ground. This was the brutality of medieval melee in its purest, most unforgiving form. There was no room for fencing, no space for the elegant swordplay often romanticized in later chronicles. There was only the crushing weight of the horse, the downward swing of the sword, and the desperate screams of men trapped beneath the hooves of the charge. Panic, usually a slow contagion in large armies, moved here with the speed of a brushfire. Saladin's wings, witnessing the sudden and total annihilation of their center, did not wheel around to flank as doctrine dictated. They simply dissolved. The discipline that had conquered Egypt and unified Syria evaporated in the face of this suicidal, impossible assault. The psychological shock was absolute. To the Muslim soldiers, this was not merely a military defeat. It felt like divine retribution, a scourge sent by God that no shield wall could withstand. In the swirling dust and screaming confusion, the backbone of the Ayyubid military aristocracy was snapped. Veteran emirs, men who had ridden with Saladin since his earliest campaigns and served as the architects of his empire, were cut down where they stood. They were not dying in grand duels of honor. They were being overrun by a tide of iron that refused to stop. The loss of institutional knowledge in those few minutes was incalculable. As the momentum of the knights carried them deep into the rear guard, the topography of the battlefield began to change. It was no longer a plain of sand and scrub, but a grotesque mosaic of broken bodies and shattered ambition. Saladin, the great unifier, was no longer commanding an army. He was witnessing the death of one. He turned his horse not to rally his men, but to flee, leaving behind the flower of his military elite to rot in the sun. A grim testament to the day the leper king proved that the spirit could conquer the flesh, provided it was clad in iron. Decades after the leper king's triumph, the sands of the Levant bore witness to a different kind of courage, not the courage of the charge, but the courage of the halt. As the dust of the skirmish settled and the Saracen lines began to fracture, a seductive whisper moved through the Crusader ranks. It was the primal instinct of the predator, the desire to pursue, to chase the fleeing enemy into the hills and trample them into history. To the common soldier, the path to Jerusalem seemed to lie open, paved with the bodies of a retreating foe. But Richard the Lionheart was not merely a warrior possessed by bloodlust. He was a master of logistics who understood the grim mathematics of survival. He looked upon his cavalry and saw what his subordinates could not. The destriers were blowing hard, their flanks heaving with exhaustion, their coats matted with sweat and dust. These beasts were the engine of the Crusader war machine, and they were pushed to their absolute biological limit. To demand a gallop now would not be a pursuit. It would be a death sentence for the mounts that gave the knights their devastating power. Richard knew his enemy too well. Saladin was a master of the feigned retreat, a tactician who specialized in luring overconfident Europeans into the broken terrain of the interior where heavy armor became a tomb and thirst killed faster than arrows. The retreat was real, yet it was also an invitation. If the Crusaders broke formation to chase the shadow of victory, they would be strung out, isolated, and butchered in the ravines. So, the order was given, controversial and crushing: hold the line. The Lionheart tightened the leash on his own army. It was a decision born of cold, calculating intellect rather than the heat of glory. He chose the preservation of his force over the potential annihilation of the enemy. By refusing to take the bait, Richard secured the field and preserved the flower of his knighthood. But in doing so, he accepted a bitter trade-off. Saladin escaped. The Sultan lived to regroup, to rearm, and to continue the war of attrition that would ultimately bleed the Crusader states dry. This was the tragedy of the tactical masterpiece. The perfection of the day ensured the stalemate of the decade. Richard had saved his army from an ambush, but he had also allowed the window for total victory to close, perhaps forever. As the sun set over the exhausted camp, the men survived to fight another day. Yet the road to Jerusalem remained as distant and mirage-like as ever, leaving the king to wonder if the price of safety was the ultimate objective of the crusade itself. The dust had barely settled over the plains of Arsuf, but the geopolitical landscape of the Levant had shifted irrevocably. Saladin, the great unifier of Islam and the conqueror of Jerusalem, had been proven mortal. For years, his strategy of feigned retreats and harassing archery had dismantled European armies with humiliating ease, creating an aura of invincibility that demoralized his enemies before swords were even drawn. Arsuf shattered that myth. The Sultan had thrown his entire strength against the Frankish column, and the column had not broken. Instead, it had crushed his center and sent his army into a chaotic flight into the woodlands. This tactical humiliation forced Saladin to the negotiating table, leading to the Treaty of Jaffa in 1192. It was a peace born of mutual exhaustion rather than friendship. The treaty acknowledged a new reality. While Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, the Crusader states were not going to be driven into the sea. The coastline, from Tyre down to Jaffa, was secured for Christendom, ensuring that the Kingdom of Jerusalem would survive, albeit without its capital, for another century. This thin strip of land, fortified by Italian naval power and the formidable castles of the military orders, became a stubborn thorn in the side of the Ayyubid dynasty, a testament to the defensive victory achieved on the road to Arsuf. From a military perspective, the battle rewrote the textbooks of medieval warfare. It demonstrated that the mobile, light cavalry of the East, supreme in the open desert, could be neutralized by strict discipline and combined arms. The Crusaders proved that a patient infantry screen, absorbing thousands of arrows to protect the heavy cavalry, could nullify the Turkish advantage of speed. By withholding the charge until the enemy was fully committed and physically exhausted, the knights transformed their heavy horses from a liability into a decisive, war-ending kinetic force. It was a lesson in restraint, proving that the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield was not the sword, but the discipline to keep it sheathed until the perfect moment. Yet, for all the tactical brilliance and strategic stabilization, a heavy silence hung over the victory. The primary objective of the crusade, the liberation of the Holy City, remained unfulfilled. The Lionheart, realizing that he could take Jerusalem but never hold it against the vast reserves of the Muslim world, famously refused to even look upon the city he could not save. The survival of the Latin East had been bought with iron and blood, but the spiritual heart of the kingdom remained behind enemy lines. As the ships prepared to depart, leaving a stabilized but truncated kingdom behind, the Crusaders were left with a haunting realization. They had won the war for survival, but lost the war for salvation. History remembers the thunder of the charge, the shattering of lances, and the cacophony of steel against steel. But the true lesson of this campaign lies in the silence that preceded the violence. The victory was not secured in the moment the Crusaders unleashed their fury, but in the agonizing hours they kept it caged. It was won in the heat and the dust, where men were forced to march through a storm of arrows, watching their comrades fall, yet forbidden to strike back until the geometry of the battlefield was perfect. This is the supreme paradox of warfare. The instinct of every soldier is to fight or to flee, yet Richard demanded the unnatural, to endure. He weaponized patience, proving that the most devastating action a commander can take is often to wait. The discipline to suffer without breaking is a far rarer quality than the courage to attack, and it was this iron stoicism that shattered the myth of Saladin's invincibility. As the dust settled over the Levant, two figures stood tall above the carnage. Richard and Saladin never met in person, yet they knew one another more intimately than they knew their own brothers. In Saladin, the Lionheart found the only adversary worthy of his strategic intellect. In Richard, the Sultan found a force of nature that could not be frightened, only maneuvered. They parted as the ultimate archetypes of the noble enemy, titans who realized that the world was perhaps too small for both of them, yet incomplete without the other. Richard would sail into the mists of history, bound for captivity and an early grave, never setting eyes on the holy city he had crossed a continent to save. The Third Crusade ended not with the gates of Jerusalem throwing themselves open, but with a quiet, stabilized border and a kingdom granted a stay of execution. It is a somber reminder that in the grand strategy of empires, tactical brilliance does not always guarantee strategic salvation. We are left with the legacy of the Lionheart not as a savior, but as a master of the terrible art of war. A man who taught history that the sharpest sword is useless without the steady hand to guide it.